the most consequential exercise in national reflection and public participation since the promulgation of our constitution in 2010.
Nchi, how are you doing? I hope you're doing fine. Now, as always, this is HiiStory, and to support us and enable us make many of these videos, please buy us a soda. There's a QR code on the top right of your screen. You can just scan and buy us a bottle or two. Anyway, into the main thing I wanted to talk about today. There's this thing called Vision 2060 or Vision Beyond 2030, as William Ruto calls it. But I know he changed it because Gachagua revealed what he was going to talk about that day. Now, to a normally thinking person, it is obvious, yeah. It is obvious because 2030 is almost coming in, and now we have to develop another vision. But to a critically thinking person, this is a strategy, because when you look at the timing of when he has launched this Vision 2060 and the elections, yeah, it is a timing, it's a strategy for next year's election. So let's listen to him and the story about the whole vision thing before I continue.
Now, every economy needs a long-term vision. But before Kenya takes stock of the promises and progress of Vision 2030, President William Ruto is already floating the idea of a new national blueprint, Vision 2060. After nearly 2 decades of implementation and public investments running into trillions of shillings, the debate now is whether Kenya needs a fresh roadmap for the next generation, or whether the real challenge has always been turning ambitious plans into reality. KTN's senior reporter Francis Ontomwa unpacks.
The unveiling of Vision 2030 in 2008 was grand and colorful. For nearly 2 decades, this defined the country's development blueprint, promising modern infrastructure, industrial growth, quality healthcare, affordable housing, manufacturing expansion, and higher living standards. But with 2030 fast approaching, many flagship projects remain unfinished, while millions of Kenyans continue to grapple with unemployment, rising living costs, and widening inequality.
We need to come up with a clear strategy detailing what we want to achieve.
Against that backdrop, President William Ruto is now readying the country for another blueprint, Vision 2060.
The most consequential exercise in national reflection and public participation since the promulgation of our constitution in 2010.
But should Kenya already be planning the next vision before fully accounting for the current one? Some analysts like Dr. Luchetu Likaka are reading much more.
We don't need a vision. However, we only need to ensure that we implement the constitution to the letter, we strengthen the political institutions and the independent offices, and fight corruption and the rule of law.
History shows that Kenya has not had a shortage of development blueprints. At independence in 1963, Kenya adopted Sessional Paper number 10 of 1965, a strategy for economic growth. In the 1980s, the government introduced District Focus for Rural Development. In 2002, the Economic Recovery Strategy for Wealth and Employment Creation, ERS, was birthed under President Mwai Kibaki. Then in 2008, came Vision 2030, with the goal of making Kenya a newly industrializing middle-income country by 2030.
This country is not short of ideas. We have amazing ideas. We know what will work for us. Most importantly is the implementation of these ideas, because a vision is great, but the implementation is even more important than the vision.
When he clinched power, Kenya's 4th president, Uhuru Kenyatta, shifted national attention to the Big Four agenda, what some analysts have argued further punctured the Vision 2030.
It is about forging.
But for President William Ruto, who has been at the center of Kenya's development agenda for nearly 2 decades as a cabinet minister, deputy president for 10 years, and our president, Analysts argue if Vision 2030 has fallen short of its targets, the country deserves an honest account from those who have overseen its implementation.
If the Mwananchi is happy, no matter which vision we have, if the Mwananchi is struggling to make ends meet, then there's a problem.
If the president implements everything he speaks about, he does not need to campaign. We will vote him by 7 a.m. But because he's not implementing and is giving us hope, you can't sell hope forever.
With the country heading for elections next year and the year 2030 just a few years from now, Kenya is already embarking on a new journey to have a new development blueprint. But is this exactly what the doctor ordered for Kenya? Francis Ontomwa, KTN, Nairobi.
Former Deputy President.
Kama kawaida, we'll have to start with the story. Now, I want you to imagine this. A Kenyan landlord whose house is leaking from the roof. The tenants are complaining. Boss, fix that roof. The landlord looks at them and says, don't worry, I have just unveiled a 30-year master plan for this house. By 2060, this building will have 6 floors, a swimming pool, a helipad, and probably a shopping mall. The tenants look at the leaking ceiling, then they look at each other, and then one of them asks, Boss, can you first fix the roof? And ladies and gentlemen, that is where President William Ruto's vision beyond 2030, which is increasingly being referred to as Vision 2060, enters our political conversation. Because President Ruto has suddenly asked Kenyans to start thinking about the Kenya of 2060. And that sounds beautiful, very beautiful. But there's just one small problem. We are in 2026. The next general election is in 2027. So naturally, we are asking, why are we discussing 2060 when politicians are already fighting over 2027? And that is exactly where today's story becomes interesting. Welcome to HiiStory, where we don't just listen to what politicians say. We ask why they are saying it, when they are saying it, and who benefits from the conversation. If you enjoy this kind of political analysis, make sure you subscribe to HiiStory because we are going to unpack this one properly. Now, what exactly is Vision 2060? Let's start with facts. President William Ruto announced that Kenya will begin a national conversation on a new development vision to succeed Vision 2030. And honestly, that part makes sense. Vision 2030 was launched in 2008 as Kenya's long-term development blueprint. It was designed to guide the country towards becoming a newly industrializing middle-income economy with a high quality of life. And because 2030 is now only a few years away, somebody has to ask, what comes next? So the idea of developing another long-term national blueprint is not strange, it is actually necessary. The government says the process should involve young people, professionals, businesses, academia, civil society, faith groups, and other stakeholders. The idea is to create a long-term national vision that goes beyond individual presidents and political administration. On paper, beautiful. But Kenya is not governed on paper. Kenya is governed in politics, and politics changes the meaning of everything. Because William Ruto is not launching this conversation in 2010, he is launching it in 2026, 1 year before an election. And that timing is impossible to ignore. Why 2060 when 2027 is just around the corner? Think about this. Ruto is asking Kenyans to imagine their country in 2060. 34 years from now. A baby born today will be around 34 years old. A young Gen Z Kenyan today could be approaching retirement age. And suddenly, the government is saying, let's talk about your future. And politically, that is very clever. Because the biggest question facing Ruto isn't simply, what did you promise in 2022? It is increasingly becoming, what future are you offering Kenyans? And those are two completely different questions. One question asks you to examine the past. the other asks you to imagine the future. And politicians generally prefer the second. Why? Because the past can be audited, the future can be promised. If I ask a politician, where's the job you promised me? That's uncomfortable. But if I ask, what will Kenya look like in 2060? Now we can bring out PowerPoint. We can bring out graphs. We can bring out drones. We can show futuristic Nairobi, electric trains, smart cities, AI, robots, flying cars, and many other shiny things, as Sifuna calls them. And by the time the presentation ends, you have forgotten that you came asking about unemployment. The 2022 Ruto is not the 2026 Ruto. Let's be clear about that. Now, let's go back to 2022. Ruto's most powerful political weapon was the hustler versus dynasty narrative. He presented himself as the outsider, the man from humble beginnings, the man fighting an established political class, the man representing ordinary Kenyans, and it worked very well. Ruto defeated Raila Odinga and became president. But look at where we are today. The man who was campaigning against the establishment is now the establishment. He is no longer knocking on State House. He is living there. He is no longer saying the government has failed you. He is the government. And that creates a political problem because you cannot endlessly campaign as the outsider when you are already sitting inside the house. At some point, the hustler becomes the establishment. And therefore, Ruto needs a new political story for 2027. And this is where Vision 2060 becomes politically interesting. Now, here comes the youth. Listen carefully to the language being used around this new vision. Education, technology, talent, creative economy, innovation, science, digital opportunities, greater monetization, talent development, young people, future generations. Notice the pattern? Youth. And that is extremely important because Kenya's young population is going to be one of the biggest political battlegrounds of 2027. Ruto knows that. The government knows that. The opposition knows that. Everybody knows it. So if the old political narrative was, I am the hustler, the new narrative could become, I am building the Kenya you will inherit. That is a much more sophisticated message. It moves the conversation from, look at my past, to imagine your future. And that is powerful politics. But then, things get even more interesting. Before Ruto's address, former Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua appeared to have knowledge of what was coming. He publicly talked about Vision 2060 and even suggested that former President Uhuru Kenyatta could have a role in the initiative. But he had denied. Then Ruto addressed the country, and instead of prominently presenting it as Vision 2060, the official language was about a new national development vision beyond Vision 2030. Now, was Ruto forced to change the name because Gachagua leaked it? Well, maybe Gachagua had information from political networks. Maybe somebody inside government talked. Maybe he was making an educated prediction. Maybe it was simply coincidence, which I highly doubt. We don't know, but politically, the timing was hilarious. Because suddenly the conversation wasn't only what is vision beyond 2030. It became how did Gachagua know? And just like that, Kenya had turned her development blueprint into a political detective series. Gachagua's comments also brought former President Uhuru Kenyatta into the conversation. Let's be careful here. He said that Uhuru was invited by Ruto to take part in the vision beyond 2030 and he rejected. But politically, Imagine the symbolism. Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto were once political partners, then they became political enemies. Ruto's 2022 campaign was heavily built around defeating the political establishment associated with Uhuru. And now imagine those two names appearing together again under something called Vision 2060. Kenyan politics would have produced the greatest plot twist since Game of Thrones. But again, we must separate that from our analysis. Now let's address the elephant in the room. Is Vision 2060 simply a re-election strategy? I wouldn't go that far. There is a legitimate reason to develop a successor to Vision 2030. Kenya needs a long-term planning, and the government says the new vision is supposed to survive changes of administration. So the idea itself isn't suspicious, but timing matters. Ruto is going into 2027 needing a new narrative. The opposition is fragmented. Gachagua is building his own political machine. Kalonzo is positioning himself. Matiang'i is positioning himself. Sifuna is building a youth-oriented political identity. ODM is struggling with its own internal contradictions. Mount Kenya remains politically unsettled, and Ruto needs something that can compete with all these narratives. So Vision 2060 could serve two purposes simultaneously. It can be a genuine national development project and a politically useful narrative for 2027. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. Here is the interesting part. Suppose the opposition says Vision 2060 is nonsense. Ruto can turn around and ask, so you don't believe young Kenyans deserve a future? That's a trap. Because suddenly the opposition is no longer attacking Ruto's record, they are attacking a vision. And visions are emotionally powerful, especially among young people. You can disagree with a politician's policies, but it's much harder to argue against. I want to build a better Kenya for young children. That's why political messaging matters. There's one enormous pattern. Kenyans don't live in 2060. They live in 2026. They are paying today's rent, today's school fees, today's food prices, today's electricity bills, today's transport costs, today's taxes, today's healthcare bills, today's unemployment, today's economic pressures. So you cannot keep telling people, wait for 2060, when they're asking, how do I survive 2026? That is the weakness of the whole narrative. Because a vision is only powerful when people believe they will actually live long enough to experience it. Now, the opposition should not simply say Vision 2060 is fake. That's lazy. They should ask much more dangerous questions. What happened to Vision 2030? Which targets were achieved? Which ones failed? Why did they fail? Who was responsible? What lessons were learned? And what guarantees that Vision 2060 won't eventually become Vision 2070? Because Kenya has no shortage of development documents. We can produce a development blueprint so beautiful that Singapore gets jealous. Then somebody puts it inside a government cupboard, and the cupboard becomes the most developed part of the project. Now let's look at something deeper. Vision 2060 may not actually be about 2060. It may be about political identity. Ruto's 2022 identity was hustler. His 2027 identity could become visionary. The 2022 message was, I came from the bottom. The 2027 message could be, I know where Kenya is going. There's a complete transformation. And politically, that is what a second-term campaign needs. A president seeking re-election cannot simply keep repeating the campaign message that got him elected the first time. He needs to create a new reason for voters to stay with him. And Vision 2060 could provide exactly that. That is the million-dollar question. But will Kenyans buy it? Because Kenyans are becoming increasingly sophisticated politically. Young people especially are asking different questions. They are asking, where are the jobs? Why are taxes increasing? Why is life becoming expensive? Where is accountability? What happened to the promises? And that is why Vision 2060 faces a major test. Ruto must connect the distant future to today's reality. If you can show Kenyans this is what we are doing today and this is where it takes us tomorrow, then the vision becomes credible. But if the message simply is, forget today's problems and imagine 2060, then Kenyans may respond, Boss Kwanza, imagine 2026. So, is Vision 2060 a scam? Not necessarily. Is there a legitimate reason Kenya needs a successor to Vision 2030? Absolutely. Is there enough evidence to say the entire project was created purely as a 2027 campaign strategy? Maybe. But is it politically useful to William Ruto going into 2027? Without a question. Because politics is not only about what you build. It is also about the story you tell about what you are building. And Ruto is trying to tell Kenyans a new story. In 2022, she told them, I am the hustler. In 2026, the message increasingly sounds like I am the architect of Kenya's future. And that is a very different campaign. But there is one question Ruto cannot escape. Before Kenyans agree to discuss Kenya of 2060, they will first ask him about the Kenya of 2026. And that is where the real political battle will be fought. Because Kenyans don't vote based only on politicians saying the country will go. They also vote based on where they believe the country has actually gone. So, I'll leave you with this question. Is Vision 2060 genuinely about building Kenya's future, or is William Ruto already building the political narrative for 2027? Tell me what you think in the comments, and if you enjoy political analysis that goes beyond the headlines and tries to understand the game behind the game, subscribe to HiiStory. Because in Kenyan politics, sometimes the speech is the story, but the timing is the real story. This is HiiStory. Until next time, bye.